Welcome to our Wednesday edition of Deep Treks. I'm Dan Shipton, and we are continuing our study in the book of Mark. Today we're going to be in Mark chapter 3, the first 6 verses, as we look at what Jesus is doing in the healing ministry. Jesus today, we're going to talk about Jesus, the healer of the Sabbath traditions. He's going to heal a person, but it's more about the Sabbath than it is about the person. When I was a child, I remember I was growing up in the era that it was kind of the end of the era where Sunday was kept aside for church and for worship and for rest. You spent time with your family. When I first was growing up, I remember when I was little, like under 6 years old, before my grandfather died, we would go to church, then we would go over to my grandparents' home. We'd have Sunday dinner at their house. We'd hang out there until late in the afternoon, and we'd eat popcorn in the afternoon and just kind of relax. And then we go back to evening church and then we'd go home for the night. And that's kind of how Sunday was for a lot of us growing up, probably. Whatever your church background, you probably went to church on Sunday. You probably didn't do a whole lot other than hang out with the family. For many Christians, up until the mid to late 70s, Sundays were set aside as a day of holiness. A lot of businesses weren't open, and in some areas it was illegal to have them open. People were more concerned with resting and spending time. And a little bit of me misses those days. Now, it's not because I have this idea that we should follow the law that way, and we're going to get into that in a little bit here. But I think we've taken it to the extreme the other way now. We have holidays like Easter, Christmas, and even national holidays like July 4th and Thanksgiving when businesses stay open. People have to go to work, which means they can't spend time with their families. And I think God created us for needed times of rest and needed times of spending time with family, spending time thinking about God and holy things. And so we've forgotten that. And that's what I miss about it. But I do think some people take things to the extreme. We have to be careful not to take God's rules and regulations to the extreme. And that's what they were doing in Jesus' time. And we can take any plan that God has, any rule that God has, any guidance for our life, and we can make it such a rule that nobody can follow it. The Pharisees had taken the law, which told them the Sabbath was to be set aside for rest, which is what Sabbath means, not just the day, but it means rest, the day of rest, or the day that God ceased creating. It goes back to creation. So it's a day of rest, to cease working, to simply focus on your family. But the law was there to give a day of rest away from work, away from the things of this world. And it was a time to remember what God had done. And it was a time of thanksgiving because God gives rest. And there were even Old Testament rules that said if there was an emergency, like a donkey fell into a hole, then you could get it out. But by the time Jesus comes on the scene, they've kind of pushed those laws aside. And they've made it the law that no one can work. And there are still Jews, even to this day, that are so devout, any type of work on the Sabbath is considered work. And I don't mean just work like we think of going to work. I mean like lighting a match. Had a friend a teacher that told us about going over to Israel one time, and they got up in the morning and the food wasn't cooked, or wasn't, they usually make it the day before, and it wasn't warm because their pilot had went out and they couldn't get the stove lit because they were all such devout Jews they couldn't work on the Sabbath, which means they couldn't light a match. They had to wait for a Christian to come down and light a match because they know we don't consider that work. They, in Jesus' time, had taken these extremes, and they would not even do good work on the Sabbath. Jesus tells us the story of the Good Samaritan, and in that story, it's told how religious people on their way up to worship didn't want to get their hands dirty, didn't want to defile themselves, so they wouldn't even stop and help somebody who had been beaten up and left for dead. Now, that is not what God's word says about keeping the Sabbath or staying holy. We're supposed to help other people in need. And so in Mark chapter 3, we come across this instance where the Pharisees who are holding that law are going to try to hold it over Jesus. And they're looking for an opportunity, and they actually try to set him up. And it says in verse 1, he entered the synagogue, and the man was there with a withered hand. They watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. See how they set him up there? And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come over here." He said to him, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath," or he said to them, sorry, not to him, to them, "is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. You see, they couldn't answer because they knew there were instances in the law for doing good, like saving an animal. If you can save an animal, you surely can save a person. They looked around he looked around at them angry, it says in verse 5, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him on how to destroy him. You see, this is where it all begins. They want to get rid of Jesus because he's preaching against the law of the Sabbath. I want to tell you, he came to restore the Sabbath and what it really is about. Jesus heals this man in front of everyone. He, in fact, has him stand up in front of everyone to make the point because he knows this is a setup. And he puts it back on them. Should I heal somebody on the Sabbath? Should I do good on the Sabbath? Or should I not? What should I do? They were silent because they knew the answer was you do good on the Sabbath. You see, he's trying to heal the sin of the people who were so concerned about the law that they forgot to care about people's lives and souls. And there are still people today who are modern day Pharisees within Christianity. They try to hold the law so tight. And they say that people are, they got to do it this way or they got to do it that way, that they cannot accept certain people seeking salvation. They can't accept certain people being called by God. And the reality is God's going to call who he calls. He's going to bring in people who he brings in. Throughout the Bible, he brings in the people that no one else would bring in. When David killed Goliath, he was too small, too young, and too out of touch with the reality of how a kingdom runs. But he did it anyway because he did it in the power of God. When Amos came to town, he was a simple shepherd coming against the religious establishment of the Old Testament to tell them how they had forgotten to care for the people's spiritual needs, and they weren't leading the flock of God like they should. God used a shepherd to try to show them how they weren't leading the flock right. And here, Jesus comes in, and he's confronting them on the Sabbath to remind them the Sabbath is not about the law. The Sabbath is about the freedom and the gift that God has given us. The gift of ceasing and resting and having holiness and seeking God's holiness and seeking righteousness and goodness. It's about ceasing doing things the way the world does it and doing things the way God intended it. Yes, it's about rest. We all need rest because we are created for it. People who work 7 days a week should read the Bible carefully because God gave us the gift of rest. He wants us to take a break, and he wants us to spend time with him. Jesus is really restoring this day of rest to doing good for God, a time for remembering God's creative purpose in restoration, a time for saving lives in restoration. So what about us today? Are we seeking to do the good that we can wherever we can? I think sometimes we have to be careful because we can get tied up not just on Sabbath laws, but in other ways, and we don't help others when God puts it on our heart to do so. We ignore the needs. But we're told continually that Jesus had compassion on them. So are we ruled by the laws of rule and right, or are we ruled by compassion that drives our hearts like Jesus was? Another thing that we can look at today is, what are we doing to make room in our own lives for spending real time with God? Spending time listening to him. It's hard to know the right things to do when he's calling us to do them if we aren't actually spending time, taking a break away from the normal daily routines and listening to him. I hope that God blesses you today, and I hope that you take some time to think in your life about what's going on. Take those blessings that he gives you as you trek this life, and may you bless others along the way.
That's today's Devo on Deep Treks. No matter how deep the questions or dark the doubts, there's always a path forward. Reach out at deeptreks.com with prayer needs or topics you'd like us to explore. Keep trekking. Renewal is never far away. Be blessed on the journey and bless others along the way.